Welcome to class. Today we are going to talk about communicative competence. This term communicative competence, coined by Hymes in 1966, has a very serious consequences in many ways that we are going to explore today. But before referring to and going to communicative competence, we need to understand the background and the response of Hymes in 1966 to the term and the concept given by Noam Chomsky, the generative linguist. He talked about linguistic competence. So, linguistic competence and communicative competence, they both stand opposite each other as a response to each other. So, communicative competence can be seen as a response to Chomsky's idea of linguistic competence. And the response was so serious in the sense that Hymes took the study of ethnography of communication and came up with speaking model. So, on one side, Chomsky's idea of linguistic competence, which refers to the underlined and underlying mental representation of grammatical structures and language in human mind, communicative competence essentially refers to the actual use of it. So, the ability of the individual speaker to actually use the knowledge of language in real world situation, in a socio-cultural context. And this is seen as a serious response to Chomsky's idea of linguistic competence. So, before we talk about communicative competence, let us talk about linguistic competence, to which this came as a response. I quote from 1965 Chomsky's work, Aspect of the Theory of Syntax. And in its introduction, Chomsky writes, I quote, linguistic theory is concerned primarily with an ideal speaker-listener in a completely homogeneous speech community who knows its, that means the speech community's language perfectly fine and is unaffected by such grammatically irrelevant conditions as memory limitations, distractions, shifts of attention and interest, and errors, whether they are random or characteristic in applying his knowledge of language in actual performance. And that's a very profound statement if you look at. So, clearly Chomsky delinks two things here, the ability or the capability of the language user and the actual act of performance. So, he is talking about the abstract level of that mental representation of language which deals with the grammatical computation in human mind and makes it possible for the language speaker to have intuitions about grammaticality, non-grammaticality, ungrammatical sentence, grammatical sentence, acceptable sentence, non-acceptable sentence, and the predictions the speaker can make versus vis-a-vis the actual use of it. So, he is delinking competence from performance. He calls it I language, internalized language, which is implicitly there as a speaker of that language. So, language is being interpreted and represented here at that abstract mental level, where he focuses more on computational aspect of it. Whereas he says that, look at the phrase he uses, he says, unaffected by such grammatically irrelevant conditions as memory limitations, distractions, shift of attention, interest and errors. So, these are the characteristics that he attributes to performance. So, performance is restricted and controlled and influenced by these grammatically irrelevant conditions. So, he is not concerned about that. So, simply he is not focusing on performance, but instead he is focusing on the underlying mental representation of language and grammatical computational ability of the human mind, that he calls competence, linguistic competence, he says. And he says that the ultimate goal or the primary goal of linguistic theory should be concerned with understanding language in this perspective. So, he rules out the performance, not explicitly, but this is what implicitly it means. So, he calls this knowledge of language as I language, which is shared by all speakers of that language in that particular speech community without variation. So, what variability you find in terms of performance, and the performance of an individual cannot be related and it cannot reflect the actual competence of the speaker. So, here we find a very clear difference between competence and performance, a delinked asymmetrical relationship. This was Chomsky's position in 1965. So, he does not see language, okay, let me rephrase my sentence. He does not focus on language as a social reality, which is used actually in the socio-cultural context. So, he is not referring to the ability of the speaker to use that language in performance. He is talking about the abstract idea and the knowledge that the speaker has, which he can or she can dispose at his or her will in performance, but in no way actual performance reflects the actual capability or the competence of this user. So, we need to understand this asymmetry and contrast that he underlines, and he calls competence, linguistic competence, I language, and the actual performance E language, internalized language I language, and externalized language, external factors governed by external factors, E language, right. But there's a few phrases, a few terms that he mentions here: ideal speaker and listener, that was a bone of contention. Then completely homogeneous speech community, again this is another bone of contention, and lots of debates have taken place defining, understanding these concepts. Then this idea that they are unaffected, this knowledge is unaffected by grammatically irrelevant conditions. So, clearly Chomsky places a lot of thrust and importance on linguistic theory, the goal of linguistic theory to understand, explain and predict this computational aspect of language represented in human mind. So, this is what Chomsky talks about. So, he takes this to an abstract level. As a reaction to it, Hymes coined communicative competence, right. Again, the historical reference can be found in Saussure's idea of la langue and la parole. So, la parole, the actual use of it. So, if you look at the Chomskyan position and Chomskyan perspective, language is a complex system and generative capacity miraculously develops with the help of an input language acquisition device, that is LED. This process is fast, effortless and requires no instruction. This is what he talks about this acquisition process, how we acquire this language. It recognizes patterns, develops rules and generates a perfectly fine system called language. Results in a body of language or knowledge of language. So, this is what he is talking about, knowledge of language which is acquired by human child effortlessly without an instruction, with limited input available, but the learning is perfectly fine. Why? Because there are certain underlying factors he attributes to LED, language acquisition device, and UG, universal grammar. Universal grammar, which is set of universal principles of language, human language across all languages, and parameters are the superficial surface level differences that we find in languages. So, if you look at the Chomskyan perspective and the Chomskyan position, he talks about the abstract representation, mental representation of language in human mind, and he refers to that knowledge as knowledge of language, which is universal in nature, shared by all speakers of language in that particular speech community, and the speaker or the user of language has intuitive native speaker in command and intuition in filtering out or in ruling out any ungrammatical sentence or any ambiguity. So, this is Chomsky's position in explaining competence. So, what he calls it linguistic competence, and he delinks linguistic performance. As a response to this abstract explanation of language, Hymes looks at language from socio-linguistic perspective, social perspective. It is a social reality, right? A concrete entity available to human beings, and we use them in a socio-cultural context. So, competence to him refers to the ability of that individual to understand the rules and use them in the actual socio-cultural context. So, Hymes coined the term communicative competence in 1966 as a response to the perceived inadequacy, in quotes, right, of Noam Chomsky in 1965, and distinction between linguistic competence and linguistic performance. It was clearly a response to Chomsky's abstract idea, and that was perceived by such people like Halliday or Hymes and other people as inadequate explanation, right. To counter Chomsky's abstract notion of competence, Hymes explained ethnographic details of communicative competence that included communicative form and function in integral relation to each other. So, he says that structure, the form and the meaning associated, they are integral, they cannot be delinked, right. That is a Hymes position. And communicative competence is the intuitive functional knowledge, right. I will come to this phrase, functional knowledge, and control of the principles of language use. So, what he is talking about? He is not talking about grammatical structural representation in human mind unaffected by the factors that Chomsky refers to. He says that the intuitive functional knowledge about the structures, which is form and the meaning that you actually use in the real world situation, right? They are integral, they cannot be separated. So he merges these two distinctions into one. Chomsky delinked and Hymes merges it. And the intensity of response was so high that he undertook entire project of developing ethnography of communication. We will talk about Hymes ethnography of communication in some other video, in other class, but right now we are focusing on communicative competence and his responses to Chomskyan, in quotes, inadequate explanation of competence and performance. So he observes, I quote from Hymes, Hymes 1972, page 277. He says, a normal child acquires knowledge of sentences not only as grammatical but also as appropriate. So he's talking about social appropriacy, contextual appropriacy, cultural appropriacy. So form alone, a child does not alone acquires form, that is grammatical structure, but also the function of it. So form and function cannot be delinked. A child acquires them as a composite thing. We need to understand this distinction that he makes in his explanation. So I quote again, he or she acquires competence as to when to speak, when not, and as to what to speak, about whom, talk about, with whom, when, where, in what manner. In short, a child becomes able to accomplish a repertoire of speech acts, to take part in speech events, and to evaluate their accomplishment by others. Hymes 1972, page 277. This is what he says. So he says that a child not only learns the form or the grammatical structure, but also the functional aspect of it. And these forms and functions are composite and integral, related. So child learns when to speak, when not, and as to what to talk about, with whom, when, where, in what manner. So it's a total package that he's talking about. It's not like Chomsky where he delinks the underlying computational aspect of language and actual use of it. He says, Hymes says, it is composite and integral. In other words, a language user needs to use the language not only correctly based on linguistic competence, but also appropriately based on communicative competence. Here is the actual reaction to Chomsky's idea. He says that a child not only acquires the structure correctly, that means he is referring to Chomskyan linguistic competence, but also appropriacy of use. So how to use it appropriately? The performance. And combining the two as an integral part, as a composite entity, he refers to it as communicative competence. And communicative competence includes both the ability of the child to acquire the form and the ability of the child to acquire the appropriateness of these forms of use. So both the labels are merged into one, and he refers to it as communicative competence. So now you can see the distinction in theoretical position, the difference in two theoretical positions. One is generative position by Chomsky, and this is social ethnographic communication position taken by Hymes in communicative competence. So the Chomskyan linguistic competence and Hymes communicative competence, they both stand opposite each other. In Chomskyan position, what you see, the abstract underlying representation of language in terms of grammatical computational ability of human mind that constitutes the knowledge of language acquired by a child effortlessly without instructions. Here in Delheim's position, what we see? You see that the form of the language, that is the structure, and the function, that is the ability to use it appropriately, they are integral, and the child acquires both together. And this is what he means when he says that he or she acquires competence as to when to speak, when not, and as to what to talk about, with whom, when, where, in what manner. So, in short, a child becomes able to accomplish a repertoire of speech, to take part in the speech events, and to evaluate their accomplishment by others. So, this is what it means. Both Chomsky and Delhams use the notion of competence. However, where Chomsky's notion of linguistic competence refers to the tacit knowledge of language that subsumes formal linguistic subsystems such as phonological, morphological, syntactic, and semantic. So, he is talking about the form. Whereas Hymes' position extends beyond and includes in it socio-linguistic competence or communicative competence, the actual knowledge and ability of the language user that govern successful communication. So, the ultimate goal of language is to communicate, and Delhams takes his position from this point of communicability. And when we say communicability, that represents the user's or the speaker's ability to have perfect command on the form and the function of it. So, the form and function cannot be delinked, and this is what Delhams reacts to. Now, this Delhams idea of communicative competence has got a far-fetched consequences. And what is that? It gave a lot of explanation and theoretical grounding for language teaching, and that method is called communicative language teaching. And communicative language teaching draws heavily from this idea of Delhams' communicative competence, specifically in second language learning and teaching. And communicative competence refers to learner's ability to use language to communicate successfully. And Canal and Swan in 1980 defined it as a composing competence in 4 areas: words and rules, appropriacy, cohesion and coherence, and use of communication strategies. So, you can see these two distinct theoretical positions, right? One is the Chomsky position, linguistic competence and linguistic performance. Opposed to that, you have another theoretical position of communicative competence, where Delhams opposes this abstract idea of competence that Chomsky talks about. So, Chomsky enterprise is more concerned with a structural aspect of language, computational aspect of language, which has a deeper mental representation shared by all the speakers of the speech community without any variation. And he says that the goal of linguistic theory should be to explain and understand and predict this aspect of language, and he is unfazed by and unaffected by grammatically irrelevant factors, which are the constraining elements for him in performance. So, he is focusing on that abstract representation, whereas Delhams takes a different position. He considers language as a social reality, and the actual use of language determines the command of the user on language. So, he combines the grammatical structure and the appropriacy of it. So, he says that a child acquires not only the form of a language in his repertoire, but also the function of it. So, the form and the function cannot be separated and delinked. This is what Dalheim's position is. And he goes so far to the extent that he develops a complete model of ethnography of communication. That model is called speaking model. We will talk about that model in some other video. So, this is the distinction and difference between these two very sound and profound linguistic notions. One is linguistic competence and the other is communicative competence. At one level, linguistic competence is internalized language, a mental representation of grammatical structures at an abstract level, and which is accessible to every speaker of the community, of that speech community, without any variation and unaffected by external factors like shift in attention, memory loss, limited memory, occupied mind, and lots of other factors which limit the performance. At one end, Chomsky says that linguistic performance cannot reflect the linguistic competence of a speaker. On the other hand, Dalheim's position, who merges form and function, and who says that acquisition takes place in a composite way. So, a child not only acquires a structural adequacy and capability or the form of language, but simultaneously a child acquires the function of it, actual use of it, the accurate use of it, and these forms and functions combine together to give a composite unit, composite entity, and the child acquires language in these terms. So, at one end, Chomsky delinks competence from performance. At other end, Dalheim merges the two into single category, and he calls it communicative competence. So, this is the difference between linguistic competence and communicative competence. Communicative competence came as a response to Chomskyan position, and as a perceived inadequacy. So these people believed that Chomskyan explanation of the linguistic theory or language is inadequate if he does not include the actual performance or the ability of the speaker to understand the overall competence in using those forms or structures that Chomsky refers to as an underlying structure. So, we need to understand these two theoretical positions which stand in opposition to each other, almost like mirror image. They contrast each other, right? And this abstractness and perceived inadequacies are answered in terms of the theory or the concept of communicative competence. And this had got a far-fetched consequences. So, if you recall, if audiolingual method of teaching second language or foreign language is a result of behaviorist theory and American structuralism, then the communicative competence has consequences in understanding another method, right, called communicative language teaching, CLT, that we refer to. And communicative language teaching talks about this adequacy and ability of the learner not only to learn the form of the language or the structure, but also the function, the ability to use it accurately. So, I hope that now you are able to distinguish between these two terms, linguistic competence and communicative competence, and also the two theoretical positions taken by Chomsky and Hymes. In our next video, we will talk about the speaking model, and the ethnography of communication as developed by, Hymes. We'll also talk about functions of language, because M.A.K. Halliday is also seen as responding with his theories of language use, functions of language, and other functional grammar theories as a response to perceived inadequacies of Chomsky linguistic theory. So, with this, we complete it now, and we will meet in other class with all these new ideas. So, thank you very much for now.